So my name is David Lukas, and I've worked as a freelance naturalist my whole life. And I basically just spend my days hiking in the natural world, taking notes, coming home to my huge library, which is on four sides of me. These are all natural history books. I research everything that are all my questions and observations, and then I turn them into stories. I've written a lot of books, a lot of magazine articles, thousands of talks. And my most recent project is a weekly nature newsletter at lucasguides.com. So please check it out and please subscribe. I love sharing really cool natural history stories every week. And the one I just did was about how pumas are farming the landscape by where they hunt. Just an incredible topic. And speaking of books, I do have a few copies left of my book, Sierra Nevada Birds. If anyone's interested, you can send me an email and I can send you a signed copy if you'd like. So let me know. But tonight we're going to talk about bird colors. And so this is going to be a four-part series. We talked about bird bones last time, and we're going to segue into bird colors right now. And bird colors are really fascinating. I think it's one of the things that we really respond to in birds. Um, and I want to say right off the bat that this is an educational program. Uh, a lot of the images I'm using are from the internet. These are not my own photographs. I'm just using them to illustrate the talk. And I'm going to be taking a lot of material from this book, just an incredible book. So if you're interested in learning another aspect of birds' lives or learning about bird coloration specifically, this is a fantastic book. It's got so many amazing stories and photographs and diagrams in it. And there's going to be, there's other books that are more technical, but this one is richly illustrated. It's easy to read. So it's really the single best introductory text on this subject. And it's the main book that I use in my work without having to go too much deeper. And as you know, there are so many beautiful birds in the world, and we connect with birds because of their colors, I think. And there's so many that we could spend this entire hour just looking at pretty pictures of birds. But I want to tonight explore the questions of why are there so many colorful birds, and then how do birds use these colors? And it seems like every time we look at birds, we see something new because even birds that are familiar to us, a simple bird like a house finch or something, every time there's something different about them. There's like a little variation in color, something that's different. So even birds that we're familiar with have variations of colors. They're always looking different. And then there's so many varieties of birds in the world. And if you were here for my previous talk on bird bones, you might remember that I mentioned that there are 10,000 species of birds in the world, roughly, and the vast majority of them all have the same basic size and shape. Do you remember that? We talked about that. Because the constraints of flight make them all have to be a certain size. They all have to have that teardrop shape. And so one of the problems with having 10,000 birds that are all the same size and shape is that birds need ways to tell each other apart. And color turns out to be one really elegant, lightweight solution that isn't going to interfere with flight and it doesn't add any weight. So birds can just go wild with colors and it doesn't interfere with their flight. And then another thing that's different about birds is that, bird feathers are basically like tapestries that can be painted with an almost infinite variety of colors. And then on top of that, birds molt their feathers regularly, which frees them up to change these color patterns to send different messages at different times of year or at different stages of their lives. So this is part of why there's so much variety and diversity in bird colors. Let's see. And I want to mention that bird colors are really different. There's a lot of variation because I want to compare this to mammals. So when we look at mammals, and here's some selection here, what's the first thing that you notice about all of these mammals? Well, they're not very colorful, are they, right? They're always some shade of, I don't know, brown or gray, maybe with some warmer tones in there, but no bright colors. And so here's the question for you. Why is this? Why are mammals basically all some shade of gray or brown? Well, The answer is that mammals mostly live on the ground. And so they need to be camouflaged. They need to either be camouflaged so they can hide and sneak up on prey, or they need to be camouflaged so they can hide from predators and stay hidden. And then because they're all hidden all over the landscape, they need to communicate with each other, and they communicate with each other by smell. They have very powerful sense of smell, and they use that to communicate with each other either directly or through scat or urine or scent glands, but birds don't have a sense of smell and they can fly away quickly from predators. This frees them up to not have to stay hidden and they're not communicating with smells or odors. They're communicating instead with loud songs and bright colors. And here's a fun thing to think about. There's one spot on the human body where we have bright colors. We're the same muted brownish kind of color, basically. One spot where we have bright colors are our eyes. And then consider how deeply we respond to each other's eyes. When we look at each other, we look into each other's eyes because eyes are a point of color that just absolutely draw us in and compel us. And I think we are instinctively drawn to color, and it's probably one of the reasons why we end up loving birds so much. Uh, and so we live in a world of vision, color perception, and birds do too. A bird's world is dominated by their visual perception of color. And birds actually have really keen eyesight and they have highly detailed color perception. And ultimately, they're going to be using both colors and patterns to communicate, a wide variety of messages with each other. So it's just one simple example. Colors and patterns of color can be a useful and it's a very conspicuous way of signaling what sex you are. And about half of the birds in the world have males and females that look very different. We're totally used to that. So here's a red-winged blackbird. In this case, the males and females don't even share a single feather in common. Every single feather is colored differently on the males and females, which makes it instantly easy to tell the sexes apart. Other species of birds, like these flickers, the males and females may look almost identical to each other with only a few subtle differences. Here we have this red mustache. And if the male has the red mustache, and if you add a red mustache to a female, her mate will instantly think that she's a rival male and try to chase her away because that's what they're looking at. So to them, even though they look alike to us, to them, they look very different because of that one mark that they see. You can also have birds that where the female, her color pattern is just a subdued version of the male pattern. So like these Western bluebirds, they basically look the same, just a subdued version of it. And you can have a flipped example of that, and rarely this happens, where the males are a subdued version of the female. So in the Wilson's phalaropes, the male in front is a subdued version of the female in back. And in this species, they have a unique mating system. The females are dominant, and then the males do all the work of raising the eggs and the chicks. So in this case, the females are brightly colored so they can fight, attract mates, and have territories. They're doing all the same function, and color is playing an important role in that. So you have some differences like that, but at the same time, about half of the birds in the world are going to be using a different strategy where the males and females are identically colored. So in this case, these kinds of birds are called sexually monochromatic. Both sexes have the same colors. But being monochromatic doesn't necessarily mean that the colors are boring or dull, as you can tell with these scarlet macaws. Being sexually monochromatic can mean that they're as beautiful and bright as they want to be. And then because birds molt their feathers on a regular basis, every couple seasons, multiple times a year, it makes it easy for them to signal seasonal differences with different feathers in the summer and in the winter. Here we have an example of ruddy ducks. And this is going to be especially important in the birds because during the breeding season, males, as you know, wear really gaudy colors. They need this to signal aggression, competitiveness, to be sexually attractive. But for the rest of the year, especially over the winter, it's going to be exhausting and dangerous to keep wearing these same gorgeous, bright colors in the winter because when you're that bright, you're attracting the attention of predators and you're threatening other males and you're signaling that you want to fight because that's an aggressive color. During the breeding season, it's worth risking this to have the bright colors and being gaudy. It's worth risking being attacked by other males. It's worth being killed or chased by predators because it's the only way you're going to have a chance to breed. But it's going to be a tremendous disadvantage in the wintertime. So you want to be able to switch into a different plumage in the winter, which is what a lot of birds do. Colors can also be used as a signal about how old you are. And so when young birds leave the nest, they're going to be wearing temporary juvenile feathers. And it can even take several years before they start looking like an adult. Here we have an example of Western gulls, and I think they're a 4-year bird. I think they take 4 years to come into adult plumage. So why would a young bird want to have a distinct and different color pattern? Well, it's important because it signals that this bird is young, it's inexperienced, it's not a threat at all. And having a distinctive color pattern is going to prevent attacks from aggressive territorial males. And because of this, it's going to benefit both the young birds, who they don't want to be attacked, right? And it's going to benefit the males who are aggressive that have territories because they can't afford to keep chasing around every young bird that shows up who doesn't pose a threat. So it saves everyone energy and it makes their social systems more efficient. Okay, so color can be used in a lot of different ways, right? But what is color? So let's talk about that for a little bit. Color is ultimately it's light. It's part of an electromagnetic spectrum, which spans everything from gamma rays to radio waves. And we say that color is light, but when we say something is a certain color, I want you to keep in mind that what we're referring to is the light that's being reflected back to your eye. There is no color in the dark, right? So it's light being reflected to your eye. And color is not something that exists independently out there in the world. Red isn't just sitting there, like behind me. It's not a color out there in the world. Color is an energy signal, and it's happening in the space between the object that you're looking at and your brain. And in that exchange of energy, color is interpreted. And in the case of animals, they may have a simple brain, it may just be a cluster of nerve cells, but it's still perceiving light and interpreting what it is. And when we're talking about color, we are talking about one tiny slice out of this very broad electromagnetic spectrum. And this is a little sliver of visible light that our brains are tuned, and bird brains and animal brains are tuned to perceive in the midst of all these invisible energy waves. Everything on this spectrum is energy that is traveling in waves or pulses of energy. And there's nothing magical about this little band right here that we see. It's just that that's the arbitrary band of energy that the nerves in our eyes and our brains are tuned to receive and perceive as color. That's the only thing that's special about that band. And what happens here, just quickly, is light comes in through your eye and hits the back of your eyeball. And you have a whole variety of, in humans, we have millions of these rods and cones, which are picking up light in darkness and in sunlight in different ways. Um, and the light comes in and triggers the nerve associated with each rod and cone. And based on, so remember I said the energy is in waves, so you can see it going up and down in waves here, and the number of waves per whatever time frame, say second or millisecond, however many waves in that unit of time, those cells, the rods and the cones, pick that up and interpret the number of pulses as a color and send that signal to the brain. So we have in our human eyes, we have three kinds of cones. We have blue, red, and green cones in our eyes. And our brains are reading the amount of energy coming from each of those three things and mixing that information to create a color in the what they would call the RGB spectrum, red, green, blue spectrum. And the fact that our brains are reading these impulses and interpreting them as colors is a learned trait. It's not inherent in us. In fact, if a blind person gains vision, they do not see color until their brain learns how to separate signals into colors and label them. It's a learned process that your brain has to do. For most of us, that's going to happen when we're infants and not even aware of what our brains are doing. So we have millions of these rods and cones interpreting red, green, and blue. But birds are different because they have a fourth kind of cone. We have red, green, and blue. They also have one that reads ultraviolet light, which is a part of, for us, it's part of the invisible spectrum. So birds are seeing four colors. We're seeing three colors. Not only that, but birds have a little tiny oil droplet right here. It's shaded kind of a blue, I think, and it's in the cone near the tip. And as the light comes through this little oil droplet, it filters out light and creates an even more precise reading of the wavelength of light. And so birds are seeing four colors and have oil droplets, which are filtering light and giving them a narrower and more precise reading of the light that's being transmitted through that cone. That gives birds a much more heightened sense of color. And so where we might see like green leaves out in the world, birds are going to see many shades of green. They are very nuanced in what they see. And not only is ultraviolet a fourth color, so here we have the red, green, blue that humans see, but look what happens when colors overlap. It expands the range of colors that we see with three cones. Now you add a fourth one over the top of that and think about all the zones of overlap. That's how many more colors birds are going to be able to see. So for instance, like this bird, the yellow-breasted chat, looks yellow to us because we're seeing the green and red combining to create yellow, but birds are going to see yellow combined with ultraviolet light, and it's going to tell them something about color that we can't even perceive of or even imagine. Um, and remember that color, the names for colors are just made up names for parts of the energy spectrum. And because of that, it makes no sense for us to ask, well, what color is ultraviolet? Tell me what color that is. It's just a different part of the energy spectrum that we don't see. So ultimately, we can't visualize how birds see the world because there's no parallel for us to see ultraviolet colors. But one thing that's fascinating is that some people can actually perceive UV light. The problem is that human brains don't know how to read that. So we don't register it as color. They can perceive it, but they don't see it as a color. I think that's really interesting. So here's another fascinating thing. There's a story why birds can see more colors than we do. We see three colors, they see four. Well, think about how mammals first evolved. Well, mammals first evolved during the time of dinosaurs. They were small, furtive creatures sneaking around at night because they didn't want to get stepped on and killed by big giant dinosaurs. And because they only came out at night, they did not need to perceive color. So over time, they lost some of their color perception. They lost some of their cone cells. So to this day, mammals generally perceive two colors. But over time, one group of mammals came out in the daytime, moved up into trees, and started eating colorful fruits. And we call those mammals primates. And so they re-evolved back one of the colors. So most mammals are two, primates say three, and birds see four. So when we look at birds like the song sparrow and the males and females look identical, keep in mind that the visible colors that we're seeing on this bird are not the same colors that the bird is seeing. So it's not going to come as a surprise then that in over 90% of the birds in the world where males and females look exactly the same to us, they have different colors and different patterns in the ultraviolet spectrum, which is what birds see. So even though the males and females, like this song sparrow, looked exactly the same to us, to birds, the males and females are going to look different because they're going to have different colors and different patterns in the UV spectrum that we can't see. So how are colors created in birds? And there's two main ways that colors are created in birds. So they can either be created by pigments. So pigments are materials that are added to feathers. Colors can also be created by the structure of the feather itself. And there's some really important differences between these two methods, pigments and structure. So pigments, again, are added to feather tissues. They absorb some wavelengths of light and they reflect other wavelengths of light back to our eyes. And then whatever wavelengths get reflected back to our eyes is what we see as color. If you crush up a feather, grind it into powder, and that feather is colored by pigments, those pigments are still there. So the color remains intact. But if you take a feather where the color is created by structure and you grind it up and break up the structure, that color disappears because that color only exists in the structure of the feather. So the most common pigment in birds is melanin. This is the same pigment that we have in our hair and our skin. And melanin is going to create a full range of blacks and browns and grays and different golden hues. And importantly, melanin is manufactured from amino acids that are found in a bird's body. And then if there is no melanin in a feather, it's going to be white. So all of the colors on this bird, this ruffed grouse, are created by melanin. We have the browns, the grays, the blacks, and the whites all being created by melanin. And one of the fascinating characteristics of melanin pigments is that they are often arranged in very precise patterns. Look at the very precise barring and spotting and I don't know what you would call some of these things, horseshoes and stuff like that. All these amazing patterns can only happen with melanin. And also, like in this robin, all the colors in this robin are obviously created by melanin. But when we talk about melanin, there are actually two kinds of melanin pigments. So first of all, we have eumelanin, which is so EU melanin is creates all the blacks and grays that we see in birds. And then pheomelanin produces a range of rusts and golds and auburn kind of colors. And then you can combine eumelanin and pheomelanin to mix them in different ways to create a whole range of different kinds of browns. And these are the same pigments we see in humans too. So, for instance, people that have dark hair have higher levels of eumelanin, and people that have red hair have higher levels of pheomelanin. And then people that have blonde hair have low amounts of both of those pigments. So that accounts for some of our hair colors. Another kind of pigment that's very common in birds is carotenoids. And there's over a dozen different kinds of carotenoids, and they're going to produce these reds and oranges and yellows that we love to see in birds. And then we have different hues created by different mixes of pigments, and the saturation of the color, whether it's deep or light, is going to be created by the density of each one of those pigments. So carotenoids are very different than melanins because melanins are created from amino acids already contained in the protein of the bird's body, but carotenoids are only produced by plants and are never produced by animals. This means that you can only get carotenoids in your diet, and you then have to take the carotenoid pigments from the food you eat and repackage it and move it to your feathers to create these colors. And another unique characteristic of carotenoids is that they are never arranged in patterns. A feather is either going to be colored with carotenoids or it's not going to be colored with carotenoids. And then this process of eating, repackaging, and moving carotenoid pigments takes energy. So it ends up being an excellent indicator of a bird's diet and its overall health. And this means that if you're a low status bird or an unhealthy bird, your red, orange, or yellow color is going to end up looking washed out or pale. And what's going on here, as you may know, is carotenoids are antioxidants. So if a bird is unhealthy or sick, it has to make a choice. If it's unhealthy or sick, is it going to use its limited supply of carotenoids to put them in its feathers to be pretty and attract mates? Or is it going to use those for its immune system so it can get healthy again? And what turns out is that birds that are sick are going to choose their health, try to get healthy so they can come back strong and healthy and breed another day. And by definition, birds that are strong and healthy, like this beautiful house finch, are the ones that have the best territories. And the best territories are the ones that are rich in foods that have lots of carotenoids in them, and that's going to show up in the quality of their colors. If you are a brightly colored male, it means you have an awesome diet, which means that you have access to those foods, which means you have the best territory. And so you're going to be able to show that off with your feathers. And if you're a low status bird, you're going to have a poor quality territory with low quality foods, and you're going to end up looking pale and washed out like this other bird. So those are pigment colors. And these are inside of feathers, but structural colors are created by an interplay of light on the microscopic structure of the feather itself, and the color does not exist inside of the feather. So these colors are going to be formed as light comes in and shines on the surface of the feather, and the structure of the feather is going to absorb a big part of the spectrum of color and bounce some back, mostly blues and purples like this scrub jay. So it's going to absorb all parts of the color spectrum, but the structure is going to bounce blue back, and we're going to see blue when we see this bird. And remember, if you take one of these blue feathers, you grind it up into powder, what's going to happen? You're not going to have any blue. It only exists in the structure of the feather inside of the tissue. A lot of birds take this blue structural color, they combine it with yellow carotenoid pigments, and you get green. And so you see that like in this female warbler, you see it in a lot of vireos. So this is a combination of that blue from the blue jay along with yellow pigment. Oops. Um, eh, so when we were talking about structural colors, there are actually two kinds of structural colors. So some are non-iridescent, like the red-winged blackbird, and these look the same no matter what angle you're looking at. A red-winged blackbird is going to look like a red-winged blackbird. And then you have iridescent structural colors that change color as the bird moves. And you see this is a grackle, but you'll see it on like Brewer's blackbirds or something like that. The bird looks like this oily, sheeny surface that turns and moves and changes colors. In both of these examples, non-iridescent and iridescent, the black is going to be created by melanin pigments. But in the case of the red-winged blackbird, the melanin pigments are going to be mixed throughout the feather tissue, creating this velvety matte look. And I'll explain this better in a second. And in the grackle, the melanin is going to be concentrated in a single backing layer, which creates this shiny look. And here's a better example of what's going on. So iridescent colors are extremely hard to explain, but let's first understand that a bird feather has an outer skin of keratin. So keratin is the same thing as in your fingernail. The keratin on the feather, this outer skin or outer shell, is 1,000 times thinner than a human hair. It's a very, very thin, like piece of glass on the surface, kind of translucent covering. Underneath that thin shell, that thin skin, is a layer of spongy keratin. So again, it's all keratin, but one layer is just a thin sheet, one is spongy, and then at the bottom or mixed throughout are going to be backing layers of pigments. So in the case of the, like say the blackbird and the grackle we were just looking at, you have the thin sheet, you have a spongy layer, and then you have the pigment underneath it. So one way to imagine this is imagine a piece of like saran wrap on top of a sponge, on top of a piece of black fabric. That's exactly the structure was happening in a feather. A thin translucent layer, a spongy layer, and then something underneath that's reflecting pigment color. And you see iridescence like on a surface of a mud puddle, you know how the colors swirl as the oil moves around. That's basically what's happening. And what's going on with iridescence, and again, this is complicated. I'm just going to touch on this briefly. What happens with iridescence is that as light comes in and hits the surface, light reflects off the surface. In this case, the feather, but like a mud puddle with oil on it. So some light reflects off the surface. Some light goes through the surface and goes a little bit deeper into the substance and then bounces back. It's the same light, it's still bouncing back, but now it's gone a slightly longer distance. It's going through more materials, so it's a little bit slower, and that puts the wavelengths of energy out of sync with each other. And some wavelengths are out of sync, cancel each other out, and others amplify each other. And this is what creates the range of colors. Again, this is really, it's super complicated, and I don't want to pretend like I can explain this. I'm just trying to give you a quick visual on this. But I want to introduce you to the idea that colors are created in different ways. So structural, pigments, lots of different ways that colors are created. But how are birds using these for different purposes? And I think we're still doing okay on time. So first and foremost, birds are using their colors. Obviously, they're using them for social signaling. You know, you might want to tell another bird about your health. You might want to say something about your genes and how healthy you are, or how good your genes are, how attractive you are, how fit you are. But at the same time that you're doing social signaling, colors can be used for many other reasons besides social signaling. So imagine, for example, how colors interact with the bird's environment. So have you ever been walking on a beach and you found a ratty looking bleached feather laying in the sand and wondered why it's in such bad shape? Well, the reason is because feathers are constantly being broken down by the environment. Feathers actually break down fairly easily. And not only are feathers broken down in sunlight, but they are broken down by the constant abrasion of air and dirt particles as a bird is flying around and slicing through the air. All of those particles of air and dust hitting it are constantly abrading and breaking down the tissue. And so, this isn't going to matter if you're sitting all day on a branch and just sitting there and then you do a little quick flight to another branch and look for an insect and hop to another branch. That's not going to matter. But if you're spending all day soaring and soaring and soaring with your wings out in the sun, the amount of abrasion and bleaching is going to have a huge impact on the quality of your feathers. And you need to protect your most important feathers. And these are the ones at your wingtips, which create your propeller, and the ones here in the forearm, which create your lift. You need to protect those feathers. And the way to do that is to add melanin pigments. That strengthens the feather tissue and keeps them from being broken down in the sunlight as fast. And this is why a lot of the soaring birds or birds that do a lot of flying have black wingtips or black wing feathers. They're trying to protect them with melanin. So melanin pigments protect feathers against the sun, but they're also going to defend feathers against bacteria, and bacteria love to eat feathers. But when you add melanin pigments to feathers, it makes it very hard for bacteria to digest the feather tissue. So instead of trying to eat the feather where there's a lot of melanin, the bacteria is going to head for the white spots where there is no melanin because that's going to be easy to eat. And this is going to create something called honest advertising. And what this means is that, in many ways, a bird can fake its social status. It can learn how to sing a sweet song that pretends like it's a super stud, or it can develop a fancy dance that makes it look like it's a stud. Guys are kind of like this sometimes too, right? But if you have white spots on your feathers, the only way to maintain those white spots, because the bacteria are devouring them, is by having enough extra energy and extra time to vigorously groom and keep those areas clean of bacteria. You want to take oil from your uropygial gland, which is right here at the base of your tail, wipe your bill on it, keep spreading it on your feathers and keeping the bacteria knocked back. And you can only do that if you're healthy and you got such a good life that you're able to spend time doing that. So if you have these gleaming white spots, this is an honest indicator of your health and your well-being, and you cannot fake this. And females are looking for that signal to show that the male is healthy. And there are a lot of birds with white spots in their feathers for this exact reason. And when I talk about bacteria eating feathers, one way to tell how quickly bacteria eat feathers, well, how many birds do you think there are in the world? There are billions of birds in the world. How many feathers every year are they dropping? Trillions of feathers. And how often do you find a feather laying on the ground when you're on a walk? Almost never. I mean, if a bird just got killed, there might be a little pile of feathers, but you don't run into feathers laying on the ground. There certainly aren't trillions of feathers on the ground. Where are they going? Who's eating them? Bacteria, and they eat them very quickly. And in terms of color and environment, colors are also helping regulate the bird's body temperature and environment. And contrary to what you might think, black feathers are actually the best ones in hot, sunny environments like this phainopepla out in the desert. And the reason is that feathers are not actually on the skin. Feathers are actually sitting off the skin just a little bit. So black feathers absorb the sun's heat and reflect it back away without heating the body. And white feathers are best in extremely cold environments because they're letting the sun rays through the feathers to warm the skin underneath. It's just contrary to what you might think, though. And another way that colors are interacting with a bird's environment is by helping a bird hide. And this is useful whether you're trying to avoid being eaten by a predator or if you're using it to sneak up because you are a predator, you want to sneak up on your food. So you're probably familiar with the challenges of finding like a sleeping owl here or a bittern hiding in the marsh grasses. Birds can be incredibly well camouflaged by their color patterns. And at the same time, though, birds can also use their colors to hide in plain sight. And one way to do this, surprisingly, is with bold patterns like on this killdeer, because bold patterns break up the bird's outline. And this is going to work because a predator's eyes are going to be drawn to these bold patterns and they don't see the shape of the bird because their eyes are just riveted on the pattern and they're missing the bird that's standing right out in the open right in front of them. Another extremely common way of hiding in plain sight is to use counter shading. And so an object in light is naturally going to form dark shadows underneath it. And those dark shadows make the object look three-dimensional. And you can fake this as an artist by putting dark underneath a two-dimensional shape and it makes it look three-dimensional when you draw it. Well, birds use that too, but they're doing counter shading, so they flip that expected pattern. And when the undersurface is not dark like you would expect, it makes the bird look flat and two-dimensional, and it doesn't look like a bird because it doesn't have that fullness of shape that you'd expect. At the same time, though, many birds are using colors at the same time, many birds are using colors to camouflage themselves. There are other birds that are being conspicuous by choice, and this is going to be especially true for social birds that are using their conspicuous colors to find each other. And this is often true for birds where they want to feed together because feeding in a group is more efficient than hunting alone. And so many of these highly social birds are going to either be conspicuously white, like in the case of these egrets, or they might be conspicuously black, like in the case of starlings or blackbirds or crows. But again, it's a social signal like we need to find each other quickly in a big landscape, see each other, gather in a group, and then hunt together. Let's see, I think we're doing okay for time. Ultimately, the best reason to have unique colors and a unique pattern of colors is you want to say to other birds, hey, here I am. This is me. as an individual. You might want to say this to your parent or to your chick, to your partner, to your neighbor, but in every case, what you want to do is show who you are as an individual. You want to have a unique badge of what you look like. Well, think about how easily we can recognize our friends. You could see a friend in a crowd of 1,000 people and pull them out immediately because we recognize each other by our faces. And birds often obviously have this same ability, right? And they probably even have it even better because it's super important for them to immediately recognize each other. So, for example, if scientists change the pattern on a bird's face, it's going to be immediately attacked by its neighbors because they no longer recognize it as the bird they know. And this is going to be even more important if you're trying to find your mate or your chick in a dense colony like this. So, what do you think? Do you think it's going to be important in a situation like this that you can recognize an individual face? Yes, birds, they all look exactly the same to me. But birds are obviously seeing these as individuals, each one with a unique face. And at all costs, birds want to avoid fighting. And you especially want to avoid fighting a superior rival. So, one of the most critical functions of color is to serve as an honest signal of your fighting ability. This is going to benefit both the superior bird and the inferior bird because fighting is going to use up a lot of energy and it risks injury. And every fight means that you might end your breeding season. It might be the end of your life. If you get injured, you can't breed. You might even die, right? And if you're a weaker bird, you definitely want to signal that you're not worth attacking right away. You don't even want to be attacked. You want to take a chance. And if you're one of the strong birds, only the strongest birds can have the ability to show the brightest and the boldest colors because these colors are going to trigger the most aggressive responses from other dominant males. So if you're going to have the boldest, brightest colors, you want to be sure you're going to be able to fight anyone who's challenged by that. For example, red-winged blackbirds, this bright red shoulder patch triggers attacks. And birds either prominently display or they prominently hide these red color patches depending on the circumstances. Red is a really aggressive color in the bird kingdom. So just in the animal kingdom even, just think about what happens when you wave a red cape in front of a bull. It just charges. It sees red and just wants to attack. Red is a very aggressive color. And so if you're going to show red, it signals that you're aggressive, you're ready to fight, right? So if this male proudly displaying on his territory, he's feeling very confident, very aggressive, he will show the red. But if he happens to be sneaking into the territory of a neighboring male, maybe trying to get a copulation or sneak some food or take over some territory, he's going to be nervous. He's going to hide that red. He doesn't want to challenge anyone. He just wants to sneak around and pay attention to what's happening. And if he doesn't get challenged, well, he's going to start showing a little bit of red. And if he still doesn't get challenged, he's going to show more and more and more red as he gets confident until he's showing his whole patch again. And you may not realize it, but birds like red-winged blackbirds have these red patches all year. They don't go away. We don't see them in the winter because they hide them in the winter time too. This is an aggressive challenge. You can't afford to be showing that red flag all winter long and getting in the fights. You need to be hiding it and cooperating and hanging out in social groups and helping each other feed and survive the winter. You cannot be fighting, so they hide it in the wintertime. So finally, as we wrap up here, let's consider the most obvious use of color, which is to attract mates. So bright colors are going to signal a bird's genetic fitness. But keep in mind, as we said earlier, that colors are going to look different to birds than to humans. So what looks to us like a simple yellow in this yellow warbler might shimmer with many other layers of additional information to another bird. And if you're a bird with a fleeting pair bond, you just mate and the male leaves and female has to do all the work. The male's going to be the one that has all the showy plumage. And females look at those showy feathers and make a quick decision. Am I going to mate with this male? Is he going to be the father of my babies? Um, but at the same time, males can also be the ones that choose females based on their colors. And this is going to be especially true in birds that have monogamous bonds, long-term bonds, because you really want to be careful if it's a long-term partner that you pick the right partner. So females are evaluating male colors, males are evaluating female colors in those cases. So it can work both ways too. And another thing to consider is that the colors and the feathers are fixed at the moment the feather emerges. This red feather is going to stay red when the feather emerges. But the colors in the bare parts, like legs and beaks, can change over the course of days or maybe a couple weeks even. So the red in these feathers here indicate how healthy this male was a couple months ago, and the red in the bill indicates how healthy he's been over the last couple days or the last week. And so, what are the signals that we see in this bird? We see the bright red feathers, we see the bright orangish red bill, and we also see this black patch. And females might pay attention to either of these signals, any one of these signals. They might prefer the red, they might prefer the black. Black patches are actually really important information because the amount of melanin that a bird has, this is a black patch, so it's made by melanin. The amount of melanin is tied to your hormone levels. The higher your hormone levels, the larger your black patch is going to be. In other words, if you have great social status, you belong way up in the hierarchy, you're dominant, you're going to have more hormone levels, you're going to have bigger patches. Females pay attention to that. But what's interesting is that the female preferences versus of color versus patches varies. Females in one population might prefer bright red males. Females in another population a few miles away might prefer males with the black patches. So it isn't one answer, it isn't one size fits all. Females decide which they like, and it's a local tradition. And let's see. Let's keep in mind that we are drawing the colors. So we tend to make the mistake of thinking that color is the only criteria that females pay attention to. But females are also paying attention to the courtship songs, the mating displays, the quality of the territory, and all of these factors play into her decision about who she wants to mate with. Color is just one of the choices that she's reading and paying attention to. So we might think this gorgeous male would be a great fit, but the female might care just as much about his song or his courtship or his territory. So let's see. In conclusion, I think we have time for a conclusion. My goal has just been to introduce you to the world of bird colors, but this is a surprisingly rich topic, and there are so many fascinating stories to learn about. Again, I recommend that book, National Geographic book. But I want to conclude with just three short examples to whet your appetite to dig deeper into this world of bird colors. So I'll start with this example here of this great tit from Sweden. And one question that scientists think about a lot is what's happening to birds in urban environments. So scientists in Sweden started studying these great tits, and they looked at their diets in the city versus the countryside. And what they discovered is that trees in cities, in urban environments, produce lower quantities of a carotenoid called lutein, which creates yellow colors. So when you have caterpillars eating the leaves of urban trees, they have less lutein in their guts, and then the birds that eat those have different yellow colors, more muted yellow colors. And over time, this is going to impact bird populations in ways we don't understand yet. The birds in the cities are going to be colored differently than the birds in the countryside. They're going to start not breeding with each other, and things are going to start happening. Maybe they'll turn into different species. Another fascinating example we can look at is with the Egyptian vulture. So look at that face on this thing, that brilliant orange face. So based on what we've learned tonight, what creates orange colors? Well, carotenoid pigments, right? But what do vultures eat? They eat dead animals. They don't eat any fruits. They don't eat any plants. Carotenoids only come from plants. So this was a mystery to scientists where this orange was coming from. And then they realized that the vultures were not only eating dead animals, but they were intentionally eating the feces inside the intestines of those animals, specifically so they could get carotenoids to make that beautiful face. It's not a pretty thought, but it hints at how birds are
Gotta do what you
Oh, okay. But it hints at how birds are selecting their diets to maximize their colors. When you guys talk, it makes it go to your screen. One more example, and then we're done. So here's a bird we all know really well, the cedar waxwing. Until the 1960s, every cedar waxwing in North America and the United States had yellow tips on their feathers, on their tails, like this. Then around 1964, birders started noticing cedar waxwings showing up with orange tips on their feathers. And this happened more and more, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. It took a lot of astute detective work, but scientists were finally able to figure out that around the 1960s, the early 1960s, people started planting a new non-native plant called Morrow's honeysuckle, which produces orange fruits. And it became a very popular plant that was planted in the Midwest, especially. And the addition of just one new item to their diets started changing the appearance of cedar waxwings, and these started showing up. So I just mentioned these three examples to inspire your curiosity to learn more, but also to point out that scientists are still learning a lot about bird colors and how they're produced. In fact, there's 10,000 species of birds in the world, and only a handful of feathers from those birds have been examined to learn what pigments are in them. So obviously, they're going to start discovering more pigments, more stories. There's a lot more going on with all the colorful birds of the world. So I want to conclude by returning to our original question, why are there so many colorful birds in the world? And I think the cheeky answer to this is that birds are colorful just because they can be. You're able to fly away, you're able to quickly escape from predators, and this has freed up birds from the constraints of needing to always stay hidden like mammals do. And given this freedom to get away from predators quickly, birds have just taken the ball and turned color into an astonishing range of uses. They can use color to camouflage themselves, they can show off, they can protect themselves in an environment, they can make personal statements, they can find each other. And ultimately, it's clear that birds are aware of their own colors and the messages they're sending because a bird will actually turn in the sunlight to either diminish or amplify certain colors in different situations. So I guess, if you're this pretty as these birds are, it helps to know what you look like and then use it to your full advantage. And having all of these flamboyant colors doesn't necessarily improve your chances of avoiding predators or living longer, but it definitely improves your chances of finding a mate, and in the end, that might be the greatest advantage of all.